What's good, family? I hope you guys doing amazing for real. Love you guys so much from my whole entire heart. For sure, I do. I can't even believe I'm saying this right now, family, but we finally got our first real look at Persona 6 in some form. Not concept art, not just a logo, not even what the color of the game is going to be, but we actually got a teaser that shows visuals and atmosphere and a glimpse of what this game is going to feel like. So in this video, family, if y'all will indulge me, of course, I want to break all of this down on a psychological level. I want to go through the symbolism, the themes, and what I believe Atlus might be trying to communicate with this small teaser. And after that, I really want to hear what y'all think too, family. So make sure to drop any thoughts, theories, or predictions or opinions in the comment sections, because this is one of these reveals where I believe there's a lot more than what's going on the surface. Based on the teaser alone, Persona 6 appears to be taking the series in a much darker and more atmospheric direction, like Shin Megami Tensei rather than Persona. The biggest clue is the game's green color palette, which traditionally symbolizes both life and growth, as well as decay, corruption, and sickness. Unlike a bright or hopeful green though, this trailer uses a muted, almost sickly tone that immediately creates discomfort rather than comfort, suggesting something organic that has begun to deteriorate rather than flourish. The graveyard setting is especially significant because Atlus chose to begin this reveal not with any kind of action or dialogue or characters, but with an environment defined entirely by finality. The rows of graves stretch across the frame under constant rain, and instead of emphasizing tragedy in a dramatic sense, the presentation feels quiet, distant, and emotionally eroded. The rain also does not feel like cleansing or renewal here in the slightest. Instead, it feels like a slow and continuous force of wearing things down, as if time itself is physically present in the scene, gradually dissolving what remains of meaning. Even the stillness of the environment becomes a part of the message. It creates a sense that what is being shown is not a moment of death like in Persona 3, but the aftermath of it. What remains when everything is active, emotional, and remembered has already begun to fade. The inclusion of the headless statue reinforces this idea of erosion, but in a more symbolic and unsettling way. The purpose of a statue is typically meant to preserve memory, to immortalize a figure or idea in a physical form so that it survives beyond the limits of human life. But the absence of a head removes recognition, identity, and authority from the figure entirely, leaving behind only a structure without meaning. It creates the impression of something that once held significance but has been stripped of the very qualities that made it recognizable in the first place. In a broader sense, it feels like a metaphor, shout out to Metaphor, my personal game of the year, for how history and memory degrade over time, not through dramatic loss but through gradual fragmentation, where the original meaning is no longer fully accessible, and what remains after all of that is shape without context and presence without understanding. What makes this teaser even more interesting to me personally, family, is how strongly it leans into the concept of memory as something unstable rather than permanent. A graveyard is often thought of as a place of remembrance, but it's also one of the clearest representations of how memory deteriorates, because over time names become weathered, inscriptions become unreadable, and even the emotional connection to the people buried there also becomes distant and abstract. That sounds really sad when you think about it. But the graveyard in this trailer does not feel like a place of mourning so much as a place where remembrance itself is slowly breaking down. And what this formulates is a psychological tension between presence and absence. The physical markers of lives once lived are still there, but the meaning behind them feels increasingly unreachable. That tension between what exists and what is understood becomes one of the strongest emotional undercurrents of this entire presentation. The rain also amplifies this effect by functioning as a constant visual metaphor for time, because unlike sudden destruction or even dramatic change, rain represents persistence and accumulation. It's something that erodes gradually and almost imperceptibly. It doesn't destroy instantly. And in that sense, it becomes a visual representation of memory itself, slowly dissolving through repetition and distance. The longer that something is exposed to it, the less defined it becomes, until only fragments remain. And you combine that with the muted green palette that we spoke about earlier, family, and this is able to formulate an illustrative language that's centered around gradual loss rather than immediate catastrophe, which is even more psychologically unsettling because it mirrors the human experience of forgetting as a slow and continuous process. The brief imagery shown in this teaser further reinforces this fragmentation through its presentation style. Instead of clear and stable visuals, everything appears to be flickering, distorted, and partially obscured. Shout out to Expedition 33. As if us as the viewers is only catching incomplete glimpses of something that cannot be fully held in focus. This instability gives the impression that meaning itself is not fixed within the world being shown, but constantly breaking apart before it can even be fully understood. In that sense, the trailer stimulates a feeling of trying to interpret something that is actively resisting interpretation. This creates a psychological effect where us as the viewers are forced into the exact same position as the themes being implied, trying to make sense of fragments while never being given full clarity. I'll slow it down so you guys can see in the trailer, family, but there's a hidden presentation of the phrase, "Who are you?" within this trailer. And I believe that this is especially significant because rather than being shown as a direct readable statement, it appears buried within layers of flickering text and visual interference, almost like it's being suppressed or erased as soon as it emerges. This automatically transforms the phrase from a simple question into something more unstable and uncertain. It no longer feels like a direct inquiry that's aimed at us who are watching it, family. Instead, it feels like something being recovered from broken signal, like a message that only survives in fragments. That presentation already suggests that understanding the self may not be a stable or easily accessible concept within the world of Persona 6, but something that must be reconstructed from incomplete information. And what makes that idea much darker than previous Persona titles is that it removes the sense of progression that defines the series' traditional emotional core. In earlier Persona games, family, you guys know that the central message is almost always rooted in gradual self-understanding. Characters confront hidden parts of themselves, accept truths that they were avoiding, and slowly build towards a cleaner, more complete sense of identity. Even when the process was painful, it still ultimately moves towards clarity, healing, and integration of the self. But if Persona 6 is truly suggesting that the self must be reconstructed from fragmented or unreliable pieces, then that implies a much more unstable psychological reality, where clarity is not guaranteed and understanding yourself is not a destination you steadily reach, but something uncertain that we may never fully resolve. That shift fundamentally changes the emotional weight of the theme, because instead of the comforting idea that confronting yourself leads to wholeness, it introduces the possibility that even after searching, analyzing, and confronting every fragment, the quote-unquote self may remain incomplete, distorted, or constantly shifting. That makes the concept significantly more unsettling on a psychological level because it challenges one of the most consistent emotional assurances that the Persona series has traditionally offered, that self-understanding, no matter how difficult, is ultimately achievable. Even though there's no actual full music track in this teaser, that silence is kind of important on its own because Persona almost always reveals its identity through sound just as much as visuals. So based on the tone alone, I think Persona 6's music direction could lean way more atmospheric and unsettling in comparison to a game like Persona 5 that has a clean acid jazz style. Instead of something immediately catchy or upbeat, we could be looking at a soundtrack that's built around ambient textures, slow burning electronic pulses, distant echoing melodies, and distorted vocal layers that feel almost buried under the mix. It might even lead into a kind of quote-unquote decayed beauty sound design, where instruments feel slightly warped or underwater, like the music itself is being affected by the same fading and fragmentation we see in the visuals. I think the song that best represents what I'm trying to express to y'all, family, is God Blue from Expedition 33. I'll play a few seconds. If they do bring in traditional battle themes, I could see them going for something more industrial or gothic influenced, maybe blending orchestral strings with harsh synths and even choir elements that feel less heroic and more haunting, like a confrontation with something inevitable rather than something exciting. The soundtrack overall could feel less like style and swagger and more like psychological weight and atmosphere, almost like the music is pulling you deeper into the world instead of hyping you up. If we think about systems like social stats and social links, Persona 6 will almost definitely still have them in some form, but I also believe that they can evolve them to reflect the theme of identity and perception even more directly. Instead of classic stats like courage and knowledge and charm, we might even see more abstract or psychologically framed traits that reflect how the protagonist is shaped by experience over time. No one asked for this, family, but I came up with 5 hypothetical social stats that Persona 6 could potentially have. This will probably never happen, but I just did this for fun and I want to know how y'all feel about it in the comments, family. The first one is called memory. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is a stat that focuses on how well the protagonist retains information, understands the past, and connects pieces of information together. If the game's themes revolve around fading meaning and fragmented understanding, then memory could become a major stat to uphold. Instead of intelligence, you would have something called awareness, the ability to notice details, read situations, recognize inconsistencies, and perceive things that other people overlook. This would fit really well if urban legends, occult phenomena, and hidden meanings are important to the story. Resolve would be similar to courage, but it would be less about bravery and more about maintaining your sense of self under pressure. If the game explores instability or psychological uncertainty, resolve could represent your ability to remain grounded when confronted with disturbing truths. This is a really unique one, but this one is called legacy. Instead of measuring what the protagonist knows or can do, it could measure the impact that they have on the people around them. The more lives you touch and the more meaningful connections you build, the stronger this stat becomes. That would tie directly into the themes of remembrance and being forgotten. Rather than the traditional charm stat, you would have something called presence. Presence could represent how strongly you influence a room or leave an impression on other people. In a story that's potentially focused on perception and memory, being remembered could become way more important than simply being liked. Now, the social links in this game, I can potentially see them feeling a lot more fragmented and layered and not just straightforward relationship building, but they could also be considered connections that reveal different versions of characters depending on how much you understand them. It could even play into the idea that no one is fully known at face value and that every single bond has multiple hidden sides that only reveals themselves under certain conditions or emotional states. For combat and dungeon design, there's a strong chance that Persona 6 will continue the evolutions of palaces and mementos, but pushes them into something more surreal and unstable. Instead of the clearly structured themed dungeons like we see in Persona 4 and Persona 5, dungeons could feel more abstract and dreamlike, almost like shifting spaces built out of perception, memory, and emotional residue. Imagine environments that don't stay consistent, where corridors subtly change when you're not looking, or areas that feel like they're fading in and out of existence. That would fit perfectly with the idea of fragmentation and uncertainty. Combat itself obviously is going to keep that same turn-based foundation, but visually it might feel heavier, slower, and more impactful. The combat will put more of an emphasis on the weight, the pressure, and the consequence within every single action, rather than the flashiness and the confidence. Even personas themselves can reflect more unstable and symbolic designs, reinforcing the idea that what you're fighting with is tied directly to the fractured self, rather than a stable inner power. So taking all of these aspects of this trailer together, family, the graveyard imagery, the rain-soaked stillness, the decaying green palette, the fractured visual presentation, and the obscured question of who are you, all of this contributes to a unified emotional direction that's centered around the loss of permanence. Not even just a loss of permanence, but a loss of clarity, a loss of memory, and a loss of meaning over time. All are layered together in a way that suggests a world where nothing remains fully intact in its original form. Instead, everything becomes subject to gradual distortion, where even preserved memories and symbols eventually degrade into something less defined and harder to recognize. Instead, everything becomes subject to gradual distortion, where even preserved memories and symbols eventually degrade into something less defined and harder to recognize. And within that framing, the earlier idea of self-understanding being quote-unquote achievable still exists, but it's no longer positioned as a clean or stable endpoint. Instead, it becomes something that exists inside a world that actively resists permanence, where understanding is always partial, always shifting, and always affected by the slow erosion of everything around it. But that's just obviously my speculations and my thoughts, but it doesn't matter what I think, family. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I love every single one of y'all, my whole entire heart. I appreciate y'all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you made this fun to the video, I wholeheartedly appreciate you watching to the end. Thank you for being here. Truly, thank you for being here. It means more than the absolute world to me. I'm going to catch you on my next one. All right? Sorry, everybody. I love y'all. Showski, I do.